The gunshot echoed across the valley as Nora Reynolds fired a warning into the night sky, her breath forming small clouds in the cold Oregon air of 1874. She had 20 minutes, maybe less, before the Blackwell Gang would close in on her small cabin nestled at the edge of the forest outside Oregon City. 20 minutes to decide whether to flee or fight for the home her father had built with his own hands. "They're coming from the North Ridge," a deep voice said from the shadows behind her. Nora spun around, her rifle still smoking, to find a tall stranger standing in her kitchen. His gun was drawn but pointed at the floor. Dust and trail grime covered his dark coat, but even in the dim lamplight she could see his eyes were alert and focused. "Who in heaven's name are you?" she demanded, keeping her rifle trained on him. "Mason Grayson," he replied calmly, tipping his hat. "Sorry about letting myself in, madam, but I figured you might appreciate a warning about your visitors." Nora's finger hovered over the trigger. "How do I know you're not with them?" "If I were with Blackwell, I'd have 6 men at my back instead of standing here alone," Mason said, stepping into the light. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a thin scar running along his jawline. He couldn't have been more than 30. "I've been tracking them for 2 weeks. Didn't expect them to lead me to a lady's doorstep." Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance. "They're coming closer," Mason said. "You've got a choice to make and not much time to make it." Nora lowered her rifle slightly, weighing her options. At 25, she had spent the last 3 years defending her father's homestead alone. Since his death, the neighboring landowners had made numerous attempts to drive her out, but never had she faced the Blackwell Gang, notorious for their brutality throughout the Oregon Territory. "What do they want with me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Mason moved to the window, carefully peering out from behind the curtain. "It's not you they want, it's the land. Word is there's a railroad survey coming through. Land prices will soar." He turned back to face her. "Blackwell works for whoever pays highest. Right now, that's probably Harrison Wade." Nora's stomach tightened at the name. Wade had been pressuring her to sell since her father's passing. 8 men, she counted, watching through another window as shadowy figures began to encircle the cabin. "Against the 2 of us." 7, Mason corrected. "I managed to reduce their numbers on the trail yesterday." The corner of Nora's mouth twitched. "You're not exactly bringing me comfort, Mr. Grayson." "Wasn't trying to, Miss Reynolds, just giving you facts." She shot him a surprised look. "I make it my business to know who I'm defending," he explained. "Now we can try to hold them off, or there's a back way out of here I spotted when I arrived. Your choice, but decide quickly." Nora straightened her spine, her decision made before he'd finished speaking. "My father built this place. I'm not leaving." Mason nodded, a hint of admiration crossing his features. "Then we'd best prepare. They'll wait until they think you're asleep, then make their move." He checked his revolver. "Got any coffee? Might be a long night." As Nora moved to the stove, she kept one eye on the stranger in her kitchen. "Why help me? What's your stake in this?" Mason's expression darkened. "Blackwell and his men raided a settlement near Pendleton last month, killed the sheriff, who happened to be a friend of mine." He accepted the coffee cup she offered. "I was a Texas Ranger before I came north. Old habits die hard." "A man of the law, then," Nora said, studying him. "Former," he corrected. "Now I'm just a man with unfinished business." For the next hour they worked in near silence, moving furniture to barricade windows, loading rifles, and plotting defensive positions. Mason showed her how to create the illusion that she'd gone to sleep by placing pillows under her blankets and gradually lowering the lamps. "They'll come from multiple directions," he explained. "We'll need to hold the kitchen and main room, the bedroom's too exposed." As they worked, Nora found herself watching the stranger's movements, efficient, calm, practiced. There was something reassuring in his confidence, even as danger closed in around them. "Tell me about your father," Mason said suddenly as they crouched near the front window. "Must have been quite a man to raise a daughter with your spirit." Nora smiled despite herself. "Thomas Reynolds was the gentlest soul until crossed. Taught me to ride, shoot, and read Shakespeare by firelight. Unusual education for these parts. He believed a woman should be able to fend for herself and still appreciate beauty." She checked her shotgun's loading mechanism. After my mother died of fever when I was 12, it was just the two of us. He never remarried. Mason nodded. My father was similar, raised 4 boys after my mother passed, taught us right from wrong, though my brothers didn't always listen. And you did, she raised an eyebrow. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. More than most. Their conversation ended abruptly as the sound of a snapping twig came from outside. Mason extinguished the last lamp with a quick breath, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the faint glow from the dying fire. They're moving in, he whispered, positioning himself beside the door, gun ready. Remember, wait until they're close enough that you can't miss. Nora took her position by the far window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The night seemed to hold its breath around them. Then came the soft crunch of boots on hard, packed earth, approaching from multiple directions. A low whistle signaled something between the outlaws. Mason gave Nora a silent nod. She steeled herself, finger hovering over the trigger of her father's shotgun. The first crash came as someone kicked at the back door. Simultaneously, the window near Nora shattered as a figure attempted to climb through. She fired without hesitation, the blast illuminating the room for an instant. The intruder fell back with a cry. Mason fired twice in rapid succession at shadows moving past the front porch. A man shouted in pain. Reynolds, a gruff voice called from the darkness. We know you're in there, just want to talk business. Business conducted at midnight with broken windows isn't business I'm interested in, Blackwell, Nora shouted back. Mason glanced at her, impressed by her composure. Wade's offering double what this land is worth, the voice continued. Be reasonable, woman. My land is not for sale at any price, Nora replied, moving to another window as she spotted movement. The answer came in the form of gunfire. Bullets splintered the window frame inches from her head. Mason pulled her down just as more shots ripped through the cabin wall. You all right? He asked, his face close to hers in the darkness. Yes, she whispered, suddenly aware of his hand on her shoulder. They're trying to draw our fire, make us waste ammunition, he explained. 3 on the east side, 2 at the front, likely 2 more circling to the west. What's our plan? Mason checked his ammunition. We hold until dawn if we can. In daylight, they lose their advantage. Another volley of shots tore through the cabin. A lantern on the wall shattered, spilling oil that ignited instantly. Flames began to crawl up the wall. Damn it, Mason muttered. They're trying to smoke us out. Nora crawled to the kitchen, returning with a water bucket. Together, they managed to douse the flames before they could spread, but the distraction had served its purpose. The back door splintered under the force of an axe. Mason positioned himself in the hallway, firing twice. A man cried out, then fell silent. 6 left, he said grimly. The night stretched on in a tense standoff. Twice more the outlaws tried to rush the cabin, and twice they were driven back by the defenders' gunfire. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, both Nora and Mason were exhausted, faces streaked with gunpowder and sweat. They're regrouping, Mason observed, peering cautiously through a broken window. Blackwell won't want to risk more men in daylight. Nora slumped against the wall, finally allowing fatigue to show. Will they leave? No, he replied honestly. They'll wait, maybe try to starve us out. She nodded, having expected as much. I have provisions for a week, maybe more if we're careful. We need to get word to the marshal in Oregon City, Mason said, checking his wounds, a shallow graze along his arm and a splinter cut on his cheek. You have a back way out of here, something they might not be watching. Nora hesitated, then nodded. There's a root cellar with a tunnel my father built during the border disputes. Leads to a small creek about a quarter-mile east. Mason's eyebrows rose. Your father thought of everything. He believed in preparing for the worst while hoping for the best, she said, allowing herself a small smile. The tunnel entrance is beneath the pantry floor. As the morning light strengthened, they took turns keeping watch while the other rested. No further attacks came, but occasional movement in the trees surrounding the cabin confirmed the outlaws remained. By mid-morning, they had formulated a plan. Mason would use the tunnel to reach Oregon City and return with the marshal, while Nora held the cabin. Neither liked the idea of separating but saw no alternative. "You'll be gone at least until tomorrow," Nora said as she helped Mason prepare. "I'll ride straight through," he promised. "Just keep your head down and don't engage unless they force your hand." As he prepared to leave, Nora found herself reluctant to see him go. In the span of one night, this stranger had become her only ally. "Mason," she said softly as he checked his gun one final time, "why are you really doing this? It can't just be about your friend the sheriff." He paused, looking at her directly. "Some men deserve what's coming to them, Blackwell's one, and some people deserve better than what life hands them." His eyes held hers. "You remind me that there are still things worth fighting for." Before she could respond, he was moving the pantry rug aside, revealing the trapdoor beneath. "Bar this behind me," he instructed as he descended into the darkness. "And Nora, stay alive until I get back." After Mason disappeared into the tunnel, Nora replaced the trapdoor and concealed it once more. The cabin felt eerily quiet without him. She moved methodically from window to window, checking the positions of the outlaws. They had established a loose perimeter, with men positioned at key points around the clearing. Hours passed in tense silence. By late afternoon, Nora's nerves were frayed from constant vigilance. She allowed herself small sips of water and bites of dried beef to maintain her strength. As dusk approached, she noticed increased activity among the outlaws. They were preparing for something. When night fell, they made their move. A flaming arrow arced through the darkness, landing on the cabin's shingled roof. Within moments, more followed. Nora rushed to the water barrel, filling buckets to douse the flames that had caught hold above her. Each time she ventured outside to throw water on the roof, bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. "You're only making this harder on yourself, Reynolds," Blackwell's voice carried through the night. "We'll burn you out if we have to," Nora didn't waste breath responding. She worked frantically to control the spreading fire, knowing that if the roof went, the entire cabin would soon follow. Sweat streamed down her face as she fought the flames, acutely aware of how exposed she was each time she stepped outside. A bullet grazed her shoulder, tearing her dress and drawing blood. She stumbled but continued her desperate effort. Just as she thought she might lose the battle, rain began to fall, first a sprinkle, then a steady downpour that helped extinguish the remaining flames. Drenched and exhausted, Nora retreated inside. Her shoulder throbbed painfully, but the wound wasn't deep. She bandaged it as best she could, then collapsed into a chair, praying that Mason had reached Oregon City. Dawn broke with the rain still falling, turning the ground around the cabin into mud. The outlaws remained huddled beneath makeshift shelters, their determination undiminished by the weather. Nora watched them through the windows, counting and recounting, noting with dismay that their numbers seemed to have increased overnight. By mid-morning, her fears were confirmed when a new figure rode into view, a well-dressed man on an expensive horse. Harrison Wade had arrived to oversee matters personally. She watched as he conferred with Blackwell, occasionally gesturing toward the cabin. "Miss Reynolds," Wade's voice called out eventually. "I'd like to speak with you face to face. I'm unarmed." Nora hesitated, then moved to the window. "Say what you have to say from there, Mr. Wade." The man stepped forward, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. He was in his 40s, his clothing marking him as wealthy by frontier standards. "This situation has gotten out of hand," he called. "I'm prepared to triple my offer for your land. You can start fresh somewhere else, away from all this unpleasantness." "My answer remains the same," Nora replied firmly. "This land is not for sale." Wade's expression hardened. "Be reasonable, woman. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. This land will be worth a fortune to whoever owns it when the tracks are laid." "Then I suppose I'll be quite fortunate," she retorted. "You won't live to see it," he snapped, his facade of reasonableness slipping. "Blackwell's men will either burn you out or starve you out. Is your pride worth dying for?" Nora's grip tightened on her rifle. "My father's legacy is. Now get off my property, Mr. Wade." The businessman shook his head in disgust and retreated to confer once more with Blackwell. Nora watched as money changed hands, Wade clearly paying the outlaw leader for continued pressure. The day dragged on endlessly. Nora rationed her remaining water, unsure when she'd be able to safely fetch more. Her shoulder wound ached, and fatigue made her movements sluggish. As night approached again, she found herself wondering if Mason had truly gone for help or simply seized the opportunity to escape the conflict. She dismissed the thought immediately. Something in his eyes had told her he was a man of his word. Still, doubt crept in as the hours passed with no sign of rescue. The second night proved even more harrowing than the first. The outlaws, frustrated by their lack of progress, began firing randomly at the cabin throughout the darkness. Nora was forced to crawl from position to position, never staying in one place long enough to become a target. By morning, the walls were riddled with bullet holes, and she had retreated to the single most defensible corner. With ammunition running low and her strength fading, Nora knew she couldn't hold out much longer. The rain had stopped, eliminating her protection against fire attacks. As the third day of the siege dawned, she heard a commotion outside. Peering carefully through a bullet hole, she saw Wade gesticulating angrily at Blackwell. "I paid you to handle this quickly," the businessman shouted, forgetting caution in his anger. "The woman's more stubborn than expected," Blackwell replied coolly, "but it ends today. We're going in at noon from all sides at once. She can't cover every approach." Nora's heart sank. She counted her remaining ammunition: 6 shotgun shells and 11 rifle cartridges, not nearly enough to repel a coordinated attack from multiple directions. As noon approached, she positioned herself near the pantry, determined that if she fell, she would do so protecting the secret escape route that Mason had used. If he returned with help, they would need that access. The outlaws began moving into position. Nora said a silent prayer, thinking of her father and hoping she had made him proud. She wondered briefly about Mason, where he was, if he was safe, if he ever thought of the woman he'd left behind in a besieged cabin. Just as the outlaws seemed ready to make their move, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. Many hoofbeats, approaching fast from the direction of Oregon City. The outlaws heard it too. Their advance halted as they turned toward the new threat. Through her window, Nora saw them first: a group of riders cresting the hill, led by a familiar figure on a bay horse. Mason had returned, and beside him rode Marshal Williams and at least a dozen deputized men. "Blackwell," the marshal's voice boomed across the clearing. "You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons." Instead of surrendering, Blackwell barked orders to his gang. Half turned to engage the newcomers while others rushed toward the cabin if they couldn't have the land. They seemed determined to exact revenge on Nora. Gunfire erupted from all directions. Nora fired at the men approaching her door, dropping one and forcing others to scatter for cover. Through the chaos, she spotted Mason dismounting, using the horse as cover while he returned fire at Blackwell's men. The battle was fierce but brief. Outgunned and caught in the open, the outlaws soon began to surrender or fall. Nora continued defending her position until she heard Mason's voice calling her name. "Nora, it's over. Are you all right?" She lowered her rifle, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. Moving cautiously to the door, she opened it to find Mason standing on her porch, his gun holstered and concern evident on his face. "You came back," she said simply, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and smoke. "I gave my word," he replied, his eyes taking in her disheveled appearance, the blood-stained bandage on her shoulder. "You're hurt." Before she could respond, her legs buckled. Mason caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her easily in his arms. "Doctor's coming," he assured her. "Marshal brought him along, figuring we might need him." Around them, the marshal's men were disarming and binding the surviving outlaws. Harrison Wade was being led away in handcuffs, protesting loudly about his connections in Portland. "Blackwell?" Nora asked weakly. "Won't be troubling anyone else," Mason replied grimly. "Neither will 3 of his men. The rest will face justice in Oregon City." The doctor arrived moments later, a kindly older man who insisted on examining Nora's wound immediately. As he cleaned and properly bandaged her shoulder, Mason explained how he had reached Oregon City just as a supply wagon was preparing to depart for the mining camps. "Rode straight through to the marshal's office," he said. Williams already had suspicions about Wade's business dealings. When I told him what was happening here, he gathered every man he could find. Fortunate timing, the doctor commented as he finished his work. This young lady couldn't have held out much longer. Exhaustion, dehydration, and that wound beginning to fester another day might have been too late. Mason's expression darkened at this assessment. He had positioned himself near Nora's side, seemingly reluctant to move far from her. "You need rest," the doctor instructed her. "Several days of it and plenty of fluids." "I'll see to it," Mason promised before Nora could respond. As the doctor packed his supplies, the marshal entered the cabin, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Reynolds, I owe you an apology," he said solemnly. "We've suspected Wade's involvement with Blackwell for months but lacked the evidence to move against him if we'd acted sooner." "You're here now," Nora replied graciously. "That's what matters." The marshal nodded, then turned to Mason. "Grayson, we could use a man like you in Oregon City. Deputy positions open if you're interested." Mason glanced at Nora before responding. "Appreciate the offer, Marshal." "Let me think on it." As the lawmen departed with their prisoners, quiet descended on the bullet-riddled cabin. Nora surveyed the damage with dismay. Nearly every window was shattered, walls splintered, furniture destroyed, and part of the roof still bore scorch marks from the fire. "It can be repaired," Mason said, reading her thoughts. "It will take months," she sighed, allowing herself to acknowledge the full extent of her losses for the first time. "Then it's fortunate you have help," he replied. When she looked questioningly at him, he added, "I'm not riding out until I know you're safe, and that includes having a solid roof over your head." "You've already done more than I could have asked," Nora protested weakly, though relief flooded through her at his words. "Consider it enlightened self-interest," Mason said with the hint of a smile. "I've developed a certain fondness for this place and its owner." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Mason stayed, helping Nora rebuild what had been damaged. The marshal sent men from town to assist with the heaviest work, and neighbors who had previously kept their distance fearing Wade's influence now came forward with offers of help. As they worked side by side repairing the cabin, Nora learned more about Mason's past. He had indeed been a Texas Ranger, earning a reputation for tracking skills and unwavering principles. After his closest friend was killed in an ambush, he had headed north, taking odd jobs and occasionally hunting bounties on particularly dangerous criminals. "Never stayed in one place long," he admitted one evening as they sat on the newly repaired porch. "Never saw the point." "And now?" Nora asked, watching his profile in the fading light. Mason turned to meet her gaze. "Now I'm reconsidering the benefits of putting down roots." Each day brought them closer, their initial wariness giving way to genuine affection, and then something deeper. Mason proved to be not only capable with a gun and hammer, but gentle in unexpected ways, leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table, reading aloud from her father's books in the evenings, listening intently when she spoke of her hopes for the future. By the time the railroad surveyors actually arrived in late summer, the cabin had been fully restored and improved. Mason had built a larger barn and helped Nora expand her vegetable garden. He had also accepted the marshal's offer of a deputy position, riding into Oregon City 3 days a week, but always returning to the cabin by nightfall. The railroad representatives confirmed what Wade had known: the planned route would indeed cross a corner of Nora's property, making it valuable indeed. They offered fair compensation for the right-of-way, which Nora accepted after consulting with Mason and a lawyer from Portland. "Your father would be proud," Mason told her the evening after the contracts were signed. They stood together near the edge of her property, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. "You held onto what mattered and made it thrive." Nora leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she hadn't been since before her father's death. "It wasn't just me," she said softly. "You know that." Mason turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Nora Reynolds, I came to this place tracking killers and found something I never expected." His voice held an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I found a home, and if you'll have me, I'd like to make it official." Her heart swelled as she recognized the question he was asking. "Are you proposing, Deputy Grayson?" Inelegantly, perhaps, he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. But sincerely. Nora reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar along his jaw that had become so dear to her. "Then I accept, inelegant or not." Their wedding took place that autumn in Oregon City, with Marshall Williams standing as Mason's best man and the doctor's wife attending Nora. The cabin that had once been a battlefield became a true home, filled with warmth and plans for the future. The railroad arrived the following spring, bringing with it new opportunities. With the compensation money, Mason and Nora purchased additional acreage, expanding into cattle ranching. When the first trains began regular service, they found themselves well positioned to supply beef to growing markets in Portland and beyond. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Nora's father, arrived on a snowy night in their second year of marriage. Mason paced outside the bedroom as the doctor's wife assisted with the delivery, his ranger's courage failing him entirely in the face of his wife's labor pains. When at last he was allowed to enter and see his son nestled in Nora's arms, he fell to his knees beside the bed. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's tiny hand. "Just like his mother." Over the years that followed, the land around Oregon City transformed as the railroad brought increased settlement and commerce. The Reynolds-Grayson Ranch prospered, expanding to become one of the largest operations in the territory. Mason continued his work with the marshal's office until Oregon achieved statehood, at which point he was appointed county sheriff. Two more children joined the family: Samuel, who inherited his father's quiet intensity, and Elizabeth, who had her mother's fierce independence. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, though Nora insisted on preserving the original structure at its heart, bullet holes and all. "To remember what we fought for," she explained when Mason questioned this decision. Harrison Wade served 5 years in the territorial prison for his role in the attack on Nora's homestead and other crimes uncovered during his trial. Upon his release, he left Oregon, reportedly heading east to try his fortunes elsewhere. Blackwell's surviving gang members received longer sentences, their reign of terror permanently ended. On the 10th anniversary of the night they had first met, Mason took Nora back to the spot where he had proposed. The valley had changed, train tracks gleamed in the distance, new farms dotted the landscape, and a small town had sprung up around the station. But the sunset was as beautiful as ever, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. "Any regrets?" he asked as they stood hand in hand. Nora looked at him, at the silver now threading through his dark hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd met. "Not one," she assured him. "Though I still wonder sometimes what made you stop at my cabin that night. You could have tracked Blackwell from a distance, waited for a better opportunity." Mason smiled, drawing her close. "Call it instinct or fate or just plain luck." He kissed her forehead. "I've never questioned the good fortune that brought me to your door." As twilight deepened around them, Nora thought of how strange life's paths could be, how danger and love had arrived simultaneously on her doorstep that night, how a man she might have shot on sight had become the center of her world. "We should get back," she said eventually. "Thomas promised to help Elizabeth with her reading, but you know how that usually ends," Mason chuckled, with Samuel playing peacemaker as always. They walked back toward their home, arm in arm. The cabin lights glowed warmly in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney against the darkening sky. Inside waited their children, their future, all that they had built together from the aftermath of violence. "You know," Nora said thoughtfully as they approached, "in my father's Shakespeare collection, there's a line about adversity being like a toad, ugly and venomous, yet bearing a precious jewel in its head." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning that sometimes the worst nights of our lives lead to the best days," she explained, squeezing his hand. "If Blackwell and his men hadn't surrounded my cabin that night, and if a certain cowboy hadn't been waiting inside with his gun," Mason finished for her, understanding lighting his eyes. Their life together had begun in danger and desperation, but had blossomed into something neither could have imagined when they'd first faced each other across a darkened cabin. The railroad that Harrison Wade had schemed for had indeed transformed the valley, but not in the way he had intended. Instead of forcing Nora from her land, it had helped her and Mason build a legacy that would sustain generations to come. As they reached their front porch, the sounds of their children's laughter spilled out to greet them. Mason paused before opening the door, turning to kiss his wife properly. "I love you, Nora Grayson," he said softly against her lips. "Have since that first night, I think, though I was too stubborn to admit it." Nora smiled up at him, the same spirit that had refused to abandon her home now shining in her eyes as she gazed at the man who had helped her defend it. "And I love you, Mason Grayson, always will." They entered their home together, closing the door on the gathering darkness. Inside, the walls that had once been riddled with bullet holes now held family portraits and children's drawings. The kitchen table where they had planned their defense against outlaws now hosted family meals and homework sessions. And the bedroom where Nora had once placed pillows to deceive attackers now held the marriage bed where she and Mason had created their future. What had begun as a siege had transformed into a lifetime of love, proving that even in the wildest days of the American frontier, amid violence and greed, something beautiful and lasting could take root and thrive if defended with courage and nurtured with devotion. Years later, long after Oregon had transformed from frontier territory to established state, the story of how Mason and Nora Grayson had met would become a favorite family tale, passed down through generations, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected circumstances, even with outlaws surrounding a cabin and a cowboy waiting inside with his gun.